What's up, y'all, and welcome to another installment of the For the Gram podcast. This is a show where I, Jaksyn, am your host, and I take you through a topic of interest to me, whether that's something new happening in the world right now, some hip trend, something like that, or it's just something that I think is interesting. But in the end, it's all going to be a topic relevant enough for the gram. In this episode, as promised, I'm going to be going through the Olympics. The 2024 Paris Games are happening right now, and I've been watching a lot of it. I haven't been watching every single bit of it because I have a life, but at the same time, I've caught as much of it as I possibly can, and I'm just going to go through some of the highlights through the first 5 days or so here on this episode. So, starting off right away, we have the opening ceremony on July 26th. So, it happened early in the day because Paris has a 7-hour time difference from the US. And so, some people were able to watch it live as it was happening. I was not one of those people. I had to wait to watch it until the primetime coverage started at 6:30. However, the actual ceremony itself did not start until about 7 o'clock. They had a little bit of a pre-show going on, but it was an interesting time because the commentators were Mike Tirico, who's been the voice of the Olympics all week, basically. And then apart from him, you had Kelly Clarkson, who was an American Idol winner, who's now a very famous country singer and pop singer. And then you also had Peyton Manning, a former athlete. So they were all being the reporters, the commentators for the entire opening ceremony. And it's interesting because they're all super energetic people, and they all kind of get away from themselves a little bit, but it was fun to listen to some of the stuff that they had to weigh in on, because it was like Kelly Clarkson was your friend sitting next to you being like, oh my gosh, I would really love to do stuff like that. Why are they performing that dance in all this crazy opening ceremony fashion and stuff like that? And so this year, the opening ceremony being in Paris, they got to go down the Seine River, and so every country was in boats. All the country's athletes were in boats and stuff, so they were promenading down the river, and you went past a bunch of France's famous landmarks, the Notre Dame Cathedral being one, the Louvre being another one, and it was just all throughout the lovely skyline and architecture that is Paris, right? So going into some of the stuff that stood out to me in the opening ceremony, starting with number one, the first aspect is it was raining the whole time. It was pouring rain, and people were in boats, and they were in ponchos covering up their amazing opening ceremony uniforms that people worked so hard designing just for them to be covered up by ponchos. I honestly thought of it as like Halloween in the upper Midwest, because you spend all this money on fancy costumes, and you end up showing off your fancy coats because it's so cold and you can't walk around just wearing your costume. You have to wear a coat. This is kind of what that felt like. It was like everybody spent all this money on these really interesting uniforms, and then they had to cover them up with ponchos so that they wouldn't get hurt by the rain. And everyone still performed as normal. I'm surprised the torch stayed lit, because during every opening ceremony you have the passing of the Olympic torch until they get to the final opening ceremony spot where they light the Olympic flame, and that's supposed to last the entire 16-day ceremony. And then this year it was raining, So I'm surprised they actually had the flame lit the entire night. But they did, and it dragged on for so long. But I watched most of it. I didn't get to watch all of it, but it was one of the most oddly cinematic things I've ever seen. Was the journey of the flame, because it just took you through all of France's history and all of its pop culture and musical contributions. Like, there was Phantom of the Opera to start it off, and they were in like the catacombs and stuff, which was really, really cool getting to show off that part of it. And there was like this hooded figure who was like the guardian of the flame throughout the entire show. And then there was an homage to Marie Antoinette, and she was beheaded, so she was literally beheaded. And then, like, she had no head on her body, she was holding it in her hands, basically. And then that immediately transitioned to the most obvious transitional choice. They went from Marie Antoinette singing opera, basically, to heavy metal, which is the most clear-cut transition you could ever hope for, right? And so they did that, and there were all these like dancers swinging around, and there was flames, and it was a really big spectacle, which I suppose is the main point of the opening ceremony, is to make it like a spectacle so that you can remember stuff that happened. And then they did a big Les Miserables homage thing. They built a barricade, and it was really cool. Les Mis is one of my favorite musicals, and so is Phantom for that matter. So I was really excited to see some of that stuff incorporated into the ceremony. And then, of course, you had Imagine by John Lennon sung, because that's sung at every opening ceremony for some reason, even though it's supposed to be a song protesting the Vietnam War. Like, I'm not entirely sure what tied everything together in that aspect, but they sang it and it was pretty good. So I can't really complain about it, other than the fact that I just don't know why they've sung it at every opening ceremony. It's just one of those like traditions that I don't really know the origin of. And then Celine Dion gave an amazing performance, and she has, I think it's called stiff body syndrome or something like that. And so she was in pain the entire time, and she did not move very much. So that tells you how painful all of this stuff must be for her. But she did really, really well. And then, of course, you have Kelly Clarkson being like, "This is amazing." And she gave all the like behind the scenes stuff where she was like, "This is a big deal and everybody should be proud of her for doing it." And it was great. It was wonderful. So there was all of that musical stuff, and the whole thing, like I said, was super cinematic. Like, the camera angles were crazy for some of this stuff before the actual ceremony even started. And then you get the processional of all the countries, and there were a few notable things with that. Mainly, Russia was not there, because the Russian athletes have had some conflictions with the Olympics, to say the least, in the last couple sessions. The most of which being that Ukraine was invaded 4 days after the Beijing Games last cycle of the Olympics. So that's a big one. And then they also bombed Kiev after the Sochi Games too, I think. And that was after they had won the most Olympic medals in history for Russia, and Russia hosted the Olympics that year. So that was wild. But they were not there. There was a doping scandal that happened earlier this year, and they were not allowed to compete. And they have not been allowed to compete under the name Russia in the last several Olympics. But this year, they were not allowed to compete at all, not even under the Olympic representative of Russia or something like that. Like they weren't able to compete under that even this year. They were just cut from the whole thing. Another notable thing is that North Korea, the country of North Korea, was allowed back into the Olympics under the People's Republic of Korea because they had to differentiate between South Korea and North Korea, because at the opening ceremony, South Korea was announced as North Korea, and they were not happy about that. They did not want to be associated with the North Korean athletes at all, and I honestly don't blame them with the amount of turmoil that's been going on in that peninsula the past several years. I just appalled with all of that stuff, but it was an interesting thing that they would slip up in that aspect. But the biggest slip up of the night was after everybody had gone through, there was the last two boats in the parade, and those were the hosts for the next two Olympic Games, being the US because Los Angeles is hosting in 2028, and then the UK because they'll be hosting in 2032. But after everybody had gone through and the Olympic torch had made its way all the way to the end, they started raising the Olympic flag. And there was a noticeable thing about the Olympic flag here. It was raised upside down. And people are often like, there are just 5 rings on the Olympic flag. It doesn't matter if it's right side up or upside down. But with the Olympic logo, there are 5 rings, the blue, black, and red up on top, and then a green and a yellow ring below it, right? And it was raised with the green and yellow ring on top. And so imagine being the people determined to raise the Olympic flag. It's like a high honor at the opening ceremony, and the flag is raised upside down. That hasn't happened before, and I'm honestly surprised that people just haven't made the mistake of flipping it upside down until now, but they did, and everybody kind of got crazy about that. But that's all I have to say for the opening ceremony, really. I just enjoyed watching the countries row by. There were some that only had like 4 athletes to their name, and then there were other countries like the US that had like 400. So you really don't realize what all these countries bring to the table until you watch the opening ceremony. And like they were saying during the opening ceremony that all but 2 US states were represented in the Olympians, one of which being Wyoming, because Wyoming has the lowest population out of any of the US states, so that kind of makes a little bit of sense. And then the other one being North Dakota. And as a proud North Dakotan, I felt a little sad about that. But it was whatever. I'm not too bitter about that. We have some representatives from Minnesota, so shout out to the bold North there. But yeah, there was a lot of craziness that happened during the opening ceremony, and that's really all I have to say about that. Moving on to day 1 of the Olympics, I watched a lot of rugby that day, and I am not the biggest follower of rugby, so like I know how the scoring works, but I don't really know like all the rules and stuff like that. But I do remember Fiji and France were in the final, and I watched the Fiji semi-final game against Australia, and I walked into the other room for like 5 minutes, and I come back, and Fiji has scored 3 tries to win the game against Australia. And if you don't know what a try is, it's basically a touchdown in rugby. It's worth 5 points, and then you kick the conversion for 2 extra points based on where you enter the end zone at. And so I walked away for 5 minutes and had won the match, and I had no idea what had happened. But then Fiji and France played in the gold medal match that day, and France ended up destroying Fiji, who had not lost a game going into the final, but they did lose when it counts to the host country, so there's always that. Another notable thing that happened on day one that I was looking into was Andy Murray, the famous tennis player. He announced his retirement. He's going to be retiring after the Olympic Games, and I think he's done now. But at the beginning of the games, he was like, I'm going to retire when this is done. And he's had a heck of a career. He's won a couple Wimbledons. He's won a couple Grand Slams. So hats off to Andy Murray. Even though I didn't always like him at times, he was a great player. So that was cool to see him on his last hurrah in the Olympics. And then the big highlight of the first week of the Olympics is your gymnastics events and your swimming events. So Brody Malone, a representative from the U.S. gymnastics team, he took a pretty bad fall in the qualifiers, and he didn't know if he was going to be able to come back. But he did. He came back. He's on the team this year, and he's been doing okay for the U.S. gymnastics team. Like, the men's are never going to be as good as the women's gymnastics team, but he's been doing okay, so that helps a little bit. And then in swimming on that first day, Katie Ledecky, the most highly decorated female athlete in the Olympics, she took bronze just barely in her first race. So that was all I have for day one of the Olympics. I didn't watch all that much that day, but I did watch a lot on day 2 and day 5. So hopefully we have some interesting things there. Day 2 of the Olympics, so this is Sunday. I watched a lot of fencing. I love fencing so much. It's one of my favorite sports to watch in the Olympics because it only comes around during the Olympics. And during the gold medal final for foil, it was the first all-U.S. gold medal match of the century. We had 2 U.S. finalists in the final for foil, and it was Lauren Scruggs and Lee Kiefer. And Lee Kiefer actually goes to the University of Notre Dame for fencing, so she has done really, really well, and her fiance is also an Olympic fencer who also goes to Notre Dame, so that's kind of cool. But this final match, if you don't know how fencing works, you go for touches with your foil, and the first person to 15 touches wins the match. And it's typically, you have 3 3-minute rounds to kind of figure out who's going to win it and stuff like that. But this gold medal match, it was 15-6, and Lee Kiefer won it in 2 minutes and 20 seconds. That just tells you how quick fencing is. And that's kind of why I like it. It's fast-paced, and you get to watch a lot of action with it because every play is basically replayed every single time. And so it was really, really cool to see that stuff when I was watching fencing. And then in the men's foil, the men's bronze match went to sudden death, which is the first touch wins after playing your 3-3-minute time frames. And that one went down to the last 2 seconds. And then the rep from Egypt ended up winning, which was cool because I really like the Egypt flag on the mesh helmets for fencing. So that was cool to see. And then there was a lot of swimming that I watched that day too. I watched the men's relay, 4x100 meter relay, and Caleb Dressel is one of the Americans in the swimming events and stuff. He was so fast. he's our anchor. He could not be touched. He was swimming so fast. There was not even a swimmer in the frame when he touched the final. It was crazy fast. And then there's French superstar Leon Marchand, who is a French swimmer, and he won the gold medal in the 400 meter medley, which, if you don't know what the medley is, it's 100 meters of each stroke. So breaststroke, backstroke, freestyle, and butterfly. And so Leon Marchand got his first gold medal on Sunday in the 400 meter medley. So he did all of the strokes. And if you don't watch a lot of swimming, like, breaststroke is the most interesting of all the events to watch cheer wise, because they're in the water for so much of it. So they'd be in the water and then they pop out, and then people would cheer as they pop out. So it's like like that's how cheering for breaststroke goes. And so that was always fun to watch during those types of races. And then there was another race that was Tori Husk. She is a U.S. swimmer. She won gold in the 100-meter butterfly by 0.04 of a second. So she had just lost in Tokyo 3 years ago. She just missed out on the podium by a 100th of a second miss. And this year she won the butterfly by 0.04 of a second. And then places 2 and 3 were within 100th of a second of each other. So it was really, really close for that. And then that's really all I have for day 2. I watched some badminton also, which badminton in Olympics is also really, really quick. And I just normally play badminton as a rec activity. I don't play it as a sport. So seeing people hit these shuttlecocks as hard as they can, like, it's insane to watch that sort of stuff. It's really crazy to just watch that sort of stuff. And so that was an interesting thing. And then Monday, I watched very little Olympics. I watched so few Olympics on Monday. But I did see South Korea win gold in archery, which archery is a cool event to watch as well, because they have these super high-tech, like, compression bows, and oh my goodness, they're insane to watch. And then I watched a little bit of canoe slalom, which is like ski slalom, but in whitewater rapids. And that one was interesting to watch too, because I can barely control a canoe in stable water, let alone in whitewater rapids. So I have a new respect for canoers in canoe slalom and stuff like that. And then a notable thing that happened on Monday was Simone Biles rolled her ankle. She rolled her ankle in warm-ups, and so she had to compete with her shin taped up the entire time, but she was still making all of her moves look so effortless and stuff like that. So it was really interesting to see some of that stuff, and she still scored really, really high for the team scores and stuff like that. So she's been battling that for the whole process of the Olympics now, and she's still been putting up really, really good numbers. So that was something crazy that happened on Monday. And then another thing that I just wanted to note was we had two of the greatest tennis players of the 2000s generation, and that was Novak Djokovic, and Rafael Nadal. They played each other in the second round of singles. So this is like really, really early on for these two greats to be playing each other. And so going into the match, this was their 60th meeting in both of their careers. And I think Djokovic was up 30-29. Like, it was really, really close. They had, I think, one more loss. I think Nadal had one more loss, and then he ended up losing to Novak in the second round, and that was a little sad because Rafa's courts are the ones that they're playing on right now. So, I was a little sad to hear that. But then later that day, I watched Rafael Nadal play with Carlos Alcaraz representing Spain in the doubles tournament, and I don't think this is fair. I don't think you're allowed to have the king and the prince in the same doubles team. Like, that's crazy. Like, I don't know how anybody would be able to go up against these guys, but they did end up losing today to the U.S. doubles team. And it was not Taylor Fritz and Tommy Paul, it was the other one, but I don't remember who's on that one off the top of my head. But Nadal-Carez is no more, and I'm really, really sad about that. But it was really cool to see them work together after all this old gen and new gen talk. But they played really, really well together. They were feeding off of each other. They were, like, making sure the other was working their hardest and stuff like that. And they both celebrated in sync, and I thought that was amazing. And it was just crazy seeing Rafa look like his younger self again. Like, he was making some plays that he hasn't made in like 4 years because he was just so into it, and it was really, really cool to see. But unfortunately, they've lost out, so the only one I can watch is the only one I can watch now is Alcaraz as he goes for the singles gold, but that's another story that we can talk about another time. Moving on to day 4, this was an interesting day because I had a dentist appointment, and at my dentist's office, they have televisions on the ceiling of the cleaning room that you go into. And so they were like, what do you want to watch? And I go, can I watch the Olympics? And they were like, yeah, you can. What's that on? And I would go, and then I give them the name of the channel and stuff like that. And then I got to watch beach volleyball while I was in the dentist's chair. And it was weird because this was an interesting round of beach volleyball because it was the 2v2 men's game. And it was the U.S. team against Morocco. And Morocco, the country abbreviation is MAR, which does not make any sense to me because there is no A in Morocco. There is 3 O's, but there's no A. So I don't even understand how they're able to get MAR out of Morocco. But that's just a long-winded side tangent that I will never get over. One of the players on the Moroccan beach volleyball team is from Casablanca, which, if you don't know, is a very, very famous movie from the 50s, the 40s. It was a really old movie, but it's one of the most classic movies of all time, and it had to deal with the French Revolution and a town in Morocco called Casablanca. And if you haven't seen Casablanca, go watch it right now. It's one of my top 5 favorite movies of all time. Like, go watch it. But if you haven't seen it, I'm still going to spoil it a little bit just because it's been out for 80 years. So you really have no excuse at this point. But in the movie Casablanca, there's a cafe called the Rick's Cafe, and they were talking about how this guy is from Casablanca, and there actually is a place in Casablanca called Rick's Cafe, but they didn't do any of the filming for the movie in this actual cafe. And it's like a big plot point in the movie, because it's like the safe house, it's the hiding spot, it's all this sort of thing. And so I thought that was just a really cool connection, because it was one of my favorite movies. And so that was an interesting thing that I got to hear. And the US had the set, so it was the final point of the match, and they had the smallest of net faults, which, if you don't know what a net fault is, it's where one of the players hits the net with their hand as they're spiking the ball over the net. And so he just hit the net barely, just barely. There was the slightest shake of it, and it got challenged and overturned. And so there was this small net fault that almost cost them the game, but it didn't end up doing that, because the US just won 2 points and won the match anyway. And so then I was listening to some of the commentary, and they were talking about it, and they were like, so what grade would you give the US men's beach volleyball team right now? And the lady who was doing the commentary said, like, a D-. They're definitely better than they were against Cuba in the first round, but they're not playing good volleyball right now. And I'm like, oh my goodness, can you even say that? Like, this is my home country. Like, this is our home country. How are you saying stuff like that? But it was fine. It was funny. They all had a good laugh about it. And so that was beach volleyball from the chair at the dentist's office that I was sitting in. And then later that day, the U.S. women's gymnastics team won gold in the team competition, and they were in a tight battle with Italy like the entire time. But they ended up pulling it out, and they won gold in the team competition, and the U.S. men's team took bronze, which I don't know how they did that, but they did, and it was cool. It was cool. It was a good day for gymnastics on Tuesday. And then another notable thing from Tuesday was U.S. tennis player Coco Gauff, who is ranked second in the world right now. She made another early exit. She lost early on in Wimbledon, and she just lost in the second round of the singles competition at the Olympics. So she made 2 early exits in the span of 2 months, and that's really, really crazy for the world of tennis. If you don't care about tennis, I'm sorry, I do, so I'm going to talk about it a little bit. And then moving on to the last day of the Olympics that I watched, the day 5, so this is Wednesday. Individual all-around events for the U.S. men's team was terrible. Like, they did not do good at all, and I'm not surprised that none of them medaled in anything, and it was just embarrassing. Another thing that happened, there was a lot of swimming that I watched that day, and so Leon Marchand won 2 gold medals, and he's the first person to win 2 gold medals on the same day in 50 years, I want to say. I think the last time was 76 that one Olympian won 2 gold medals on the same day. So that was a cool thing. He won comfortably in the 200-meter breaststroke, and he set his second Olympic record of the Olympic round, and then he ended up coming from behind in the final turn of the 200-meter butterfly. He was down most of the race, and then the last turn, he made 11 kicks underwater and came back to pull ahead, setting another Olympic record and winning by a fraction of a second. And that was the craziest thing I've seen all Olympics, was Leon Marchand coming back in that 200-meter butterfly. If you haven't seen it, Look it up right now. It is insane. I've never seen somebody swim this fast in my entire life. He was down the entire time to a Hungarian who was in the lane above him, and he managed to come back and win it in the very last leg of the race. So it was crazy. You guys have to watch this if you haven't. And then I also watched Katie Ledecky, the American swimmer. She swam the 1500 freestyle, which I believe 1500 meters is a mile. I don't know for sure about that, but it's a long time to swim, and she was just cruising the entire time, and then she won, and you could look it up. Like, there was nobody within 40 meters of her when she won. Like, that's how insane Katie Ledecky is at swimming, and this was in freestyle and stuff like that. And then the last thing that I want to talk about for the Olympics is the U.S. basketball team managed to beat South Sudan's basketball team, which they were the favorites going into the Olympics, was South Sudan. They were the favorites, and the U.S. team beat them. So I was a little happy about that. And then one last thing that I wanted to do is I just wanted to go through and recap where the countries are in medal placement as we speak. So 5th place in medals right now is going to be Australia. Australia is 5th place in medals. And then 4th place is Great Britain. So Australia, then Great Britain, and then China is in the 3rd place spot, and they actually have the most gold medals. Other countries above them have more medals total, but China has the most gold medals. And then France is in the 2, the host country's in the 2, and then the US is in the 1. Not really surprising in that regard, just because the US has so many athletes, but they're ahead of France by a reasonable margin. And so that's always just an interesting thing to look at. It's just the top 5 in medal placement as the games go on. But that's going to wrap it up for my discussion on the Olympics. I hope it was helpful. I hope it was entertaining. But now I'm just going to pop into a real quick rendition of 3 things you need to know. Number 1, the Olympians' beds in Paris. So this is kind of topical. I saw this on the news. Their beds, their bed frames that they use where they're staying in Paris are made of cardboard. So these bed frames are entirely made of cardboard in order to increase airflow to your mattress. And then it also doubles because they're 100% recyclable once all the athletes leave. So they can just take the mattress off and then recycle the cardboard. And if you haven't seen this yet, like, I'd recommend looking into it. Like, it's really, really cool that they're able to just build these beds really, really quickly. And for so many people. And then they're just able to take them apart and recycle them. And so it's just an earth-friendly way of making all these beds for all these athletes and stuff like that. Number 2, Robert Downey Jr. was announced to be playing Dr. Doom at the San Diego Comic-Con. In the Marvel panel, they said that they removed the Kang storyline. So Avengers 5 will no longer be called Kang Dynasty. It'll be called Avengers Doomsday. And then Avengers 6 will still be Avengers Secret Wars. And the villain will not be Kang the Conqueror. It'll be Victor Von Doom, the Fantastic Four villain from the comics. And this is like a big deal. And they cast Robert Downey Jr. to play this character. First, they brought back the Russo brothers to direct both of the Avengers movies. They directed the last 2 Captain America movies, Captain America Winter Soldier and Captain America Civil War. And then they also directed Avengers Infinity War and Avengers Endgame. So arguably 4 of the largest Marvel projects. were directed by these two guys. Joe and Anthony Russo are going to be directing Avengers 5 and Avengers 6. And their villain, they said they needed a big name to do it, and there was only one guy who was capable of playing this role. And this has been a topic for years. Who are they going to get to play Doctor Doom in a cinematic edition of the character? And the fan favorite was Cillian Murphy. Everybody thought it was going to be Cillian Murphy who played Victor Von Doom. My personal vote was for Dan Stevens to play him, but neither of those two things happened, and they recast Robert Downey Jr., and I think this is preposterous. I think this is a just desperate play to get people back into the theaters to watch Marvel movies again. I think this is just bonkers. Like, there is a world where this could be cool, but this world is not that world, because Robert Downey Jr. was already a beloved character in Tony Stark, and then he's being cast as Doctor Doom. I really, really, really hope that they don't make him a Tony Stark variant who turns into Doctor Doom, because then that ruins two plot lines in the MCU. They already turned Tony Stark into Uncle Ben in Spider-Man, and I didn't like that. And now they're potentially going to turn Tony Stark into Doctor Doom, and so they're just rewriting the comic book lore that has been established already, and I don't think this is the right play. I think it's just a desperation call for Marvel right now, just making Robert Downey Jr. play Doctor Doom in a movie so that we can get people back to seeing some of these movies again. But anyway, moving on. Number 3, there's this story going around from Ohio, right? That some person went to a restaurant and he had ordered these Parmesan garlic boneless wings every single time that he's gone there. And he ate one of them this one specific time, and he choked on a bone and ended up going to the hospital the next day and figured out that it had ruptured his esophagus. And so he went to the court and sued this restaurant because he ate a bone in his boneless chicken wing and ruptured his esophagus, and he didn't want to have to pay for it because he was not expecting to have a bone in his chicken wing. This past year went all the way up to the Ohio State Supreme Court, which ruled that since the chicken comes from an animal that is known to have bones in it, people should be weary of eating bones in their boneless chicken wings. That is what they ruled. They basically said a boneless chicken wing does not have to be boneless. And that was crazy. It went all the way up to the Supreme Court. It went all the way up to this super high level of state government. And they basically just redefined what a boneless chicken wing is. So they basically just went up to the highest court, and the highest court said, hey, you know a boneless chicken wing? A chicken wing that does not have bones in it? Spoiler alert, it could have bones in it. And you have to be careful about that. And I think that's funny. I think it's wild that we're going to courts to define what a chicken wing is and stuff like that. But that's going to do it for this week's episode of the For the Gram podcast. If you guys like what you heard in this week's episode, you can always DM my Instagram at forthegrahampod, all lowercases, no spaces, or you can send me an email at forthegrahampod@gmail.com. Thank you guys so much for listening to this week's episode, and I will see you in the next one.